Well, I guess my interruption sort of killed that conversation. So, Stephen, did you want to repeat the question, or should we move on?
Oh well, no. I think firstly, Nicholas broached a subject that's actually very important to understand, and that is, whilst bootstrapping, you have to figure out how the system interacts with each other. Sorry, how the stakeholders within the system interact with each other, and how that starts at a point and ultimately goes to a final state that you wish to have. So by definition, you need to have at least some sort of idea what that final state looks like, and then discover along the way these intricate relationships that you could theorize and you could imagine, but only really discover whilst you're bootstrapping. And the one aspect that's interesting is the distribution of CDP holders, their incentives and underlying biases, and how that would relate to DAI use cases. Having a look at folks and understanding the distribution of why DAI is being used and how it's being used. Because if we could create some sort of metric, and I don't know what this would look like, that gives a sense of both stakeholders, you'd be able to see potential dislocation in supply and demand. And at the same time, you could also have the ability to identify the dislocation and put remedies in place to alleviate that. So it's a very good point. I mean, that doesn't just relate between CDP holders and DAI users. I mean, there's also the CDP holders and keepers, and then MKR in terms of the distribution and governance on what collateral types you want to include. The thing becomes very intertwined. It becomes, I want to use the word complex, but not in the sense that it's complicated. It's just complex in the sense that there's just 4 stakeholders, and then there are the permutations that you have to consider around that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that, and this is something we were touching on, I think, before you joined the call, Stephen, is that right now we have this financial ecosystem. We have the CDP infrastructure. We have the risk takers and stability seekers. And right now, it seems, I guess the question is how much of this ecosystem of stability seekers that we sort of look at as a separate group of actors, how many of them are actually have their primary motivation is actually to support their risk-taking activities as well. So how large is this ecosystem? Are DAI holders primarily focused on supporting their risk-taking behaviors? Or do we have enough of an ecosystem here where people are actually using DAI for something else that we don't quite know what that activity is yet?
I think we have a general idea of what's going on and why they're using DAI. But there is a small part that's starting to grow where I don't have a clue what they're using it for. And it could actually be for the real transactional value of goods and services. That could actually be growing organically. I've always been of the mindset that we needed to sort of bootstrap and flywheel, not only just bootstrap, but flywheel the economy that allows this transactional activity to happen. But I'm getting the sense that this can actually happen very organically and by itself. It doesn't really need too much of a flywheel to get going. It just needs a presence of mind and being clear on how you can do that. And I think one use case where someone goes and buys a cup of coffee in Prague using DAI just brings everything into sharp relief and go, oh, so if this is what I can do, that means I can do this as well. And you find folks creating the necessary applications to just achieve those ends without even us participating in it. So it really is kind of exciting to see how that little part is growing without our our sense of knowledge.
You could potentially make some very educated guesses. I think that DAI ultimately is going to be bootstrapping the decentralized finance space first. I think that the primary use case here is going to be lending and borrowing on other platforms, or increasing a person's own leverage. And then it's beginning to break out now into more real world use cases. And I think that's one of the primary, actually, I was about to plug my own initiatives. I'm going to do it anyways, actually. So it's one of the primary motivations behind the granting program that MakerDAO has now, is that we need to help not only bootstrap the ecosystem of our own ecosystem and the DeFi space in general, but we also need to incentivize a wider third-party aftermarket where we can start allocating grants to people to build a market or build a payment gateway or build, or explore this vertical or this market that we haven't opened up yet, and help them to do it. Because part of our job at MakerDAO is to not only create the system, but create uses for the system, or at least help people to discover uses of the system.
The funny thing is, we've created a sort of two foundational elements, being the CDP and the ability to generate DAI. And if one has a look at the traditional finance space, you find that is, the very basic elements that everything else is built on. From banking to insurance to literally trading to financing of everything from securities through to housing, it's based on these two basic elements. So we've got that in place. Now we just need to be very clear that an actual economy can actually, really be grown on the back of it. But you do need to have a considered approach, a lockstep approach, so that you don't fly off the handle and decide that you need to generate too much DAI because it's terribly exciting, and all at the same time demand too much DAI because it's terribly exciting. It's got to be within the scope of reasonability, and it's got to be in the scope of understanding where the system is within the environment that it's serving, and how that environment is also constantly changing. My hope is that that dovetail economy between the traditional and this digital economy that's backed by blockchain, it's going to become a lot more clearer as we literally carry on. And all these use cases are going to be very obvious, 6 months to a year from now, where right now folks would not even conceive of them.
All right. I think that it might be a good segue into actually talking about. Actually, let's do all the preambles. We didn't actually do all the introductions and the explanations of what's going on here. So welcome everybody to this sort of delayed introduction to our December 13th edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk meeting with Steven Becker. This is going to be a good call because we've been anticipating part 3 of the governance framework for a while now, and Steven has released it. And we're going to go over some of the new information today, which I've been looking forward to. So I want to remind everybody that if you have questions, please don't be shy. You can just jump right on the microphone. You can interrupt, or you can type in the chat. And every few minutes, we'll take a look and ask those questions for you if you don't have access to a microphone. All right, Steven, do you want to take it away?
Certainly. So with respect to this third part, I think I've covered a lot of this beforehand, but I'm basically going to consolidate this into just one call today. And instead of going through the components of this third article, I basically want to start with just the big notion, and that is what we're trying to do is reduce contention in the voting of a proposal. We want to reduce the contention. We want to decrease the risk in a good proposal not being rejected. So it kind of feels like a statistical hypothesis that we're trying to prove. But really, how do we go about doing that? Now, everyone understands that, I think it's very clear to everyone that governance is, subject matter that is some 4,000 or 5,000 years old. So to try and figure out you can have some sort of resolution around what perfect governance to apply to the system is folly. So what you need to do is figure out what's the best that might suit you, but ultimately you need some sort of certainty or stability where you don't fly off the handle in terms of permutations when it comes to governance. And what MakerDAO has done here is purposely looked at the actual proposals that we're going to put on the table. As far as we can, those proposals need to be vetted, need to be rigorously examined, and effectively scientifically, I wouldn't say proven, but have a decent rationale that people can understand. That is where the difference comes in. That's where we reduce the contention. That's where we reduce the subjectivity, and that's also where we start reducing the normal governance problems of factions and whales and manipulation in the background. It's always going to be there to a certain extent, but we're not going to get rid of it altogether. But what we're trying to do is just use very simple premise of, if the proposals are clear and rigorous, you won't be able to dispute any subjectivity. The only thing you'll be able to dispute is if you want it and if you don't want it. Yes, it's a good idea. No, it's a bad idea. Or it'll be a case of saying, I don't like it or I do like it. It's binary. The whole thing boils down to the fact that you're going to have this very simple decision to make based on the rigor behind it. That being said, how do you go about reducing this contention? A lot of suggestions have come out, and the first thing you want to do is say, well, you want to talk about it. You want to have a dialogue around it. What's the proposal? We want to include a new collateral type. What does everyone think about it? Because ultimately, MKR token holders get to decide what is included and what's not included. To the extent that MKR token holders know about the collateral type, they'll obviously chime in and dialogue will ensue, most probably in the likes of a subreddit or even in one of the channels in Rocket Chat, in Rocket Chat. But the main takeaway from this is that a dialogue needs to start. If it's a collateral type no one's heard about, well, that's where the folks within the foundation will start the conversation. But at the same time, we also need to be aware of the fact that an analysis needs to be done on these tokens and the organizations underlying them. And this is where the bootstrap mechanism becomes very important. We have a risk team in place. This is a template risk team. This is a risk team that we are saying to everyone out there, look at the way we're working and either use us as a template to create your own risk team if you wish, or basically look at it and go, oh, we can do better, and go create your own. The point being is there's a point of reference that you can point at and say, yes, something like that, or no, I want to do it better. Either way, I don't mind. Point being is this risk team has to do this analysis. It's got to produce a very clear-cut idea of what the collateral type is, why we want to include it, and how we're going to extract the stability from this particular token and inject it into our system. That is the objective of the risk team. And the risk team has to be convincing to the point where it can be not only rigorous in terms of its conclusions, but also reproducible in terms of its conclusions. You will need to be able to take something off a website or something that is issued as a spreadsheet, put it on your own system, and then replicate and come out with the same answers. And if you don't come out with the same answers, that's where you need to basically chime in and voice your concern. So again, let's just sort of take a step back and say, what are we trying to do here? The objective is to create a system by which we reduce contention through using proposals that are generally rigorous and scientifically vetted. And we focus on specific teams that we rely on as MKR token holders to do the necessary analysis for us, which also means that we have to be very comfortable with these teams doing this. So we need to be able to understand the tools that they're using, understand why they're using it, and what sort of conclusions they come out with, and be able to say, well, that team or a risk team is a team that we can rely on.
Well, Steven, let me know if I'm jumping ahead too far. I'm always maybe too focused on implementation, so let me know if I'm off base here. But my question is, how does that happen? Is there going to be a binder of standards and policies and procedures and like this a build your own risk team type deck? Or how are people going to know that this is the bar that they need to reach for validity?
Well, firstly, it's going to be, unfortunately, another bootstrapping exercise. But the first thing we're going to do is the internal risk team is going to produce a simple, I don't want to call it a technical paper, it's just a paper with math in it to give you a sense of how the tooling works. And then come out with anything from a simple Excel spreadsheet to maybe something really, really visual on a website that you can play around with.
Well, the reason. Say again? Well, we talk about weighting a lot, so we're going to be applying this weighting system to risk teams, and that's how we can kind of determine their past successes. So would that weighting system be sort of the benchmark by which people would create these proposals or form these teams if they know that they're weighted on these 15 criteria then they would sort of maximize for those skill sets.
Yeah, that's goes back to the previous call that we had when we spoke about risk teams, and I like to group them into two parts. The first one is you may have risk teams that are functionally support, and then you have risk teams that are actually functionally submitters. So you may have a combination of risk teams that, let's say it's made up of 3 risk teams, of which 2 are supporting the one, and that one gets to actually submit the, the final parameters. At the same time, a risk team could be independent and just submit by themselves. But the weighting really comes in the beginning, it's equally weighted. But obviously over a certain amount of time, that weighting will change due to certain metrics that we hopefully will have in place, one of which is how accurate you have been and how long you've actually stuck around. I mean, those are the 2 sort of primary metrics I would like to incorporate. In terms of how the submission is done, it literally will be a case of there's a dialogue that we, as I mentioned before, that we will start. The dialogue will ensue. Then it will come to a point where an MKR token holder will submit a proposal to the governance polling. And that proposal will say, let's have a quick census on if we would like this new collateral type to be included. And that polling would have a 2-week period of consideration. I'm just using 2 weeks as an example. So over and above the dialogue, we now have this concentrated, this consideration. And why do I say consideration? Because in that proposal, you will have links to the underlying assessment of the collateral. You'll have links to the social media sites where the conversation started. So it'll be more a case of centralizing a lot of the information into a proposal, centralizing a lot of the idea into one proposal. And then after the 2 weeks of considering this proposal and the links and all the analysis and the dialogue that's happened, we obviously go into a 2-week voting period. Again, think about it this way. You're constantly trying to reduce the risk of contention. You're trying to constantly reduce the risk of factions being created by making sure that the focus of the attention is around the proposal and the scientific validity of that proposal.
David Terry, you had a question. Did you have access to the microphone, or do you want me to read that out?
Yeah, I can say it. Sorry, I was a bit loud where I was before. Yeah, my question is so this first risk team, is it going to be like internal to the foundation, or is this going to be some kind of independent legal entity at launch? Or how do we see that progressing?
The first risk team is already in place with the foundation, and our job is to just functionally put tools in place and functionally put a process in place that would start fleshing out what this template looks like. I mean, if one considers the full scope of risk management for MakerDAO, it is extraordinarily broad. So we're not going to be able to perform every single function with sufficient depth, but we will be able to elaborate on what it is and how we've gotten from step 1 all the way through to the last step, basically end to end. So to your point, the first risk team is simply a template that is part of the foundation.
Okay.
And it doesn't have a separate legal entity. Where external risk teams, they could form as separate legal entities if they wish. In fact, as they submit, you would probably find that their construct that they're working from gives a very good indication of their intended longevity. So it gives them a stable point of view and a stable foundation to operate from.
Yeah, that was my next question, Kenny. How do the risk teams make money? It's a really good one.
Oh, that's actually simple enough. So if you think about MakerDAO is deployed, this battleship is now in the ocean. We managed to build it and deploy it. The next question is, well, so what? Now MakerDAO is floating out there and it's doing its thing. But MKR token holders require quite a few things. What do they require? Well, the first thing they require is that if an upgrade needs to be made to the system, who's going to do it? There's a decision. And that decision will then come down to, okay, well, there's this identified bunch of folks. They can do the upgrade for us, and we wish them to be employed. How do we go about doing that? MKR token holders get together and say, well, let's go and hire them and ask them to do this for us. We get a scope of work, and they submit, deploy, and we pay them appropriately. Where does it come from? Well, the simplest place it does come from is the stability fee, because that is the flow of value in the system, and MKR token holders will be in a position to decide how to use that value. And part of it will go to employing external service providers, one of which would be risk teams. And really boils down to how much they cost, are they willing to do it for that cost? And obviously that is all dependent on the number of DAI that's been generated.
Is that something that you think would live like inside of the kind of actual smart contracts? Would there be like a little portion set aside that would go to the risk teams, or would that be more kind of informal off-chain governance that the MKR holders organize themselves?
I can't talk to that. I would the first thing I would surmise is that it would be off-chain, but to the extent that it could actually be placed into smart contracts, I can't talk to that. That's a little bit out of my wheelhouse.
Okay, thank you.
Kenny, did you have any follow-up questions about compensation, or did that cover things?
Yeah, well, one question here is then, I can definitely see external funding going to risk teams or for either consulting services or things that are absolutely legitimate. But then one could also say, let's say I do some, relatively scammy ICO, and then I have a bunch of funds to work with. I go to one of these risk teams, or maybe even multiple risk teams, maybe through an intermediary, and say, hey, could you, give us a really great report or something like that. I don't anticipate something like that would get through a rigorous process. So I'm not suggesting that, but so maybe just what are the potential conflicts of interest that we could potentially see?
So this goes back to the sort of first part of the conversation I think we had before we started recording, and that is bootstrapping the system to a point where you have a fair distribution of stakeholders surrounding MakerDAO. And that distribution obviously then gives the integrity and the robustness that you need for the organization. I haven't answered your question yet. I'm aware of that. So within those distributions, what you're going to have is various amounts of bias. And you're going to have various incentive schemes that people are going to devise and then try and implement. This does not exclude risk teams. This does not exclude the ability to try and manipulate risk teams. So ultimately, what we have is, as you mentioned, we've got the actual proposal that needs to be vetted appropriately from a scientific standard. That's kind of our big defense, point of defense. But still, you will have the ability to try and manipulate people as much as possible. It just really boils down to the fact that while we're bootstrapping, it sort of behooves us to try and get as many risk teams as possible. But that is constrained by the size of the organizations, constrained by where we are in terms of being able to incentivize and compensate appropriately. So we have to bootstrap a lot of this. We have to bootstrap a lot of this transition with a certain amount of vigilance and consideration as MKR token holders with respect to what they're trying to achieve and how they're achieving it. Because you're completely right. Some crappy ICO is trying to pay off a risk team to put a proposal forward. Ultimately, it should be rejected because we're very clear that once you put it through a decent amount of models, it's going to come out on the other side saying no. Be that as it may, let's say that the risk team decides to manipulate the models a little bit and it comes out looking absolutely sterling. The question at hand is that if you can reproduce this using a model that sits in a repository where everybody's open to actually explore it and use it, if they can see that there is a material difference between the model that they used to create a number and the model that they submitted when it was used to vote them in as a risk team, they're going to be found out. And as soon as they found out, I think the next thing will happen is they'll be chucked. And that really will be the end of it. Does this catch all problems? Is this foolproof? No, definitely not. That's the one thing that, the vigilance on the side of MKR token holders is so important right now, especially through this transitional period. As soon as we get to a construct where there is multiple risk teams, multiple keepers, massive distribution of CDP incentives, DAI use cases, and participants as MKR token holders, you will see that the biases will be more leveled out, so you don't get any undue influence. Well, at least that's the hope.
Did that cover your question, Ken?
Absolutely. And I can certainly see how if the rating agencies, like the traditional rating agencies, had open source models that, other people could check, maybe some of those AAA assets, maybe they wouldn't have been so AAA, but maybe they would have. But a lot of a degree of transparency and diligence is actually, it's pretty important in reproducibility, right? Because that's the scientific.
Exactly. So you actually hit something on the nail there. So if the ratings agencies had their models open for for anyone to look at, would things be different? Strangely enough, they did. Their models were transparent. What was not transparent, and this is the interesting part, was the data that went into it. And that is where the reproducibility comes in, because it's almost like saying, well, here's a cheese grater, but I'm not going to tell you what cheese I'm going to use. And anybody can look at the cheese grater and go, oh yes, I know what it is. Makes sense. That's how you do it. If you had a block of cheese, this is how you'd use it, and life's easy. But the problem being is that when they want to start using it, they might have got some sort of rotten cheese. It's the same principle applies. Reproducibility is not just about the model; it's about the data as well. Data sourcing, data integrity, data cleaning. All of this is actually a function that I would assume would be wrapped up in a, one risk team. If you just have a look a little bit into the future, one risk team would probably be very good at getting the data from all the exchanges instead of relying on, for instance, CoinMarketCap. They'll go to all the exchanges, they'll capture it, they'll basically consolidate it, and they'll say, well, this is what we consider to be the true representation of data. Not to put actually, just to really overemphasize, I've said this beforehand. I mean, in my previous life, I've used, Bloomberg, Reuters, and a number of other consoles. And I can tell you that you could download a historical series of, let's say, Walmart, and you'll find that Bloomberg will not have the exact same data as, for instance, Reuters. It's really remarkable. They'll be very consistent throughout 90% of the data, maybe even 95% of the data, but there's going to be inconsistencies there. And those inconsistencies show you that even in the most developed companies, you're still going to have these problems. So a risk team that just focuses on data sourcing, management, and integrity, I mean, it's almost as important as someone who creates a model and submits the values.
Those are all great points. I think that you've touched on this before in a meeting, Steven, where when we bring in this weighting system, it's the risk teams that have published and open models and open data sets will be weighted higher than other risk teams that are using some kind of secret proprietary method as well. So.
Would we ever want to allow risk teams that have closed data? Or is that something that we see being useful?
Well, no, but the idea here is very much like bias. Your level of transparency is effectively your bias. And if you are not transparent, it just gets weighted against you. So you might have, let's say Kenny's example where some crappy ICO goes and tells a risk manager, please, put this forward. And they use a risk team to put their token forward. And that risk team says, sure, because, we don't have to show the full transparency because it's all proprietary. So we'll just have to show an output. Given that, it will be weighed against what other risk teams do. So the other risk teams will go, oh, so you want to have a look at token ABC. Where'd you get the data from? Oh, we're not going to tell you. Okay, we'll go get our own data. And on doing that, they're going to come out with different numbers. So there's firstly the weighting against not being transparent, but at the same time, if you are found out because you're not transparent, it's just a higher probability of you getting chucked out the system. So you are incentivized to be transparent. And if you're not transparent, then you are extraordinarily incentivized to be very accurate. Because if you're not accurate and some other risk team finds you out, you're toast. So ultimately, it would behoove you to be as transparent as possible.
One thought that came to my mind, if we're talking about like conflict of interest as well as has there been any kind of discussion around requiring the risk teams to stake some MKR or something to better align their incentives with the health of the system? I don't know if you could get any meaningful security from that, or it would be too much MKR. I don't know. It's just a thought.
Well, a risk team, if they wish to put a proposal forward into the sort of voting construct, they will obviously need to have MKR. But to the extent that they stake, I've heard that suggestion before. I'm certainly not against it. I just don't know how that will work right now, because you have these permutations where you can have collections of risk teams working together to submit, versus the notion of many or rather multiple risk teams that just work independently. And then within those risk teams, they could cover either the full spectrum of what is required for the system or just concentrate on a certain part. So there's a lot of sort of supply chain dynamics within the risk function that services MakerDAO. And I don't know if staking is going to incentivize that appropriately or not. So, I mean, that's an open question I don't have an answer to.
Right, thank you.
Steven, we did have a question from Akiva. It was more related to how debt ceilings work. Did you want to save that to the end of the meeting, or do you want to sort of jump off topic for a second?
What's the what is the question?
Akiva, do you want to ask it, or do you want me?
Yeah, so I'm wondering what the debt ceilings will look like for real estate collateral. So the thing is, it could be a function of liquidity and volatility. So for Ether is more volatile, but more liquid as well. So wondering if the debt ceiling is a function of the volatility or the liquidity, because real estate might be less liquid, but less volatile. So I'm wondering if we can have a higher debt ceiling.
Okay, so the risk parameters from my point of view are basically derived from something called liquidity adjusted value at risk. Okay, so you've actually encapsulated both points that you just spoke about now in one calculation. One being is liquidity, and the other one being volatility. The two have to go together, especially in our space, because the larger the position size you're talking about, the larger the impact that you have on the market price. And to that end, and I'll just say this quickly, you've got two types of impact, right? You've got one called exogenous, which is a more natural liquidity in the market, where if you sell something, you might have the price go against you a little bit, but the expectation is the price will bounce back. So it's a very natural liquidity. Then you've got one that's called endogenous, which is more of a permanent shock. You sell a large stake, the price goes down, it stays down. So you have those two elements, and those two elements are very much dependent on the size that you want to drop into the market. And the size that you drop into the market is also dependent on how you manage it appropriately. If you decide that you're going to have, $150 million worth of ETH, and you need to drop it into the market right now, obviously you're going to have a more endogenous impact than you're going to have a natural or exogenous one. So you have to think about a time period over which you want to, liquidate your position. So the debt ceiling really comes from the idea of what's the maximum amount that we could liquidate over a certain time period that doesn't have too much of an endogenous effect. And I've actually done that calculation a couple of million times already, and it's really interesting. You would think that most folks would be of the mind. I'll get to your real estate example now. You would think that most folks would be of the mind, well, you should be worried about getting rid of the stuff now. Well, actually, that's the worst thing you can do. When you have a complete market crash and everything is going absolutely ape, it actually shows that it shows generally, not sometimes, it shows generally that if you participate in that panic, all you're doing is inducing more of the panic. If you allow a broader time frame, you have a better chance of actually participating in consolidated periods or recovery periods. So there's all these aspects that I've kind of intersected together to come up with the concept of what the debt ceiling is going to look like. Back to real estate. Now, real estate, I suppose we can also lump in something like gold, has to be considered from 2 points of view. One, the organization that is representing that particular commodity or that particular asset. And two, the token as well, because you may have a really good, well-structured token, but you might have a terrible organization. And you might have, sort of vice versa, a great organization, but a terribly structured token. And that obviously impacts how you will set the debt ceiling for that particular asset. And the issue here is that when it comes to real estate, you have to think about the final sense of recourse. If somebody liquidated that collateral type, how do they go about realizing their liquidation event that they wish to have? And I note I didn't say how they wish to go sell. I'm talking about an actual liquidation event into something else that matters to them. They may want to go and find recourse to dollars, or they may want to go find recourse into some other token. The point being is that the whole construct needs to be considered and be available to them. So from a real estate point of view and like a gold point of view, you'd naturally think, oh, and the debt ceiling is going to be really big because, that's a lot of value there. But it's not necessarily true. It's very much dependent on the organization structuring this and what recourse you have to the actual underlying asset. Does that cover it?
Yeah. Yeah, that's good.
Jordan, do you want to make I see your comment there. Do you want to read it out? I'm just. Jordan says that he thinks that in the foreseeable future, other members of the team have said that individual tokenized real estate probably will not be accepted as collateral, but only large tokenized groups or portfolios that might be more liquid than you think. Yeah, true enough. No worries, Jordan. But your statement is actually, it is correct. The ability, here's the thing I love about the space we're in. In your traditional market, you basically have the spectrum of liquidity. And the spectrum of liquidity comes with a structure of something called a liquidity premium, which is pretty simple. If something is hard to sell, it's going to be valued less. And if you take the same thing and it's easy to sell, obviously it's going to be more, going to be valued higher. So it's going to have a natural price discovery mechanism. So therefore, the difference between the two is the premium. And what blockchain does is it actually allows us to take all these illiquid, for lack of a better word, or dead assets and create the potential of liquidity around it. So the realization of the liquidity premium becomes more evident and becomes possible. And because of that, you actually bring a lot more assets into the economy. You bring a lot more of it into the economy. You bring a lot more into the financial space so that you can actually derive more real value from a sort of velocity point of view as well. So ideally, keeping in mind that we are trying to capture that liquidity premium, but at the same time being very cognizant of the fact that not everything will be able to immediately realize their premium just because they've been put onto the blockchain, just because they've been tokenized. So that's why there is that need to understand what the token looks like, versus the organization and versus the assets. So there's 3 layers of consideration. And ultimately, and this is one thing that you might find a risk team becomes, is a legal risk team, where their focus is just on how do you get recourse for all these assets? How do you get ultimate recourse? Because if for instance, if you think about Digix, the ultimate recourse is literally flying to Singapore and getting your gold nugget out of their vault and going to the broker around the corner and selling it to them. And then you're realizing your Singapore dollars and you're done. You've had your liquidation event. But that recourse from start to finish is really the most important thing. And what we're doing at the moment is our recourse is just simply secondary market price discovery. That's just what we're doing right now. But the ability to consider so many collateral types is just really all about how efficient you can make that that recourse vector. Anything else?
So I have a question. So is there going to be like a version of Maker in the future that is going to be sort of like a walled garden for all of the tokenized securities and stuff?
I don't think there'll be a version of it, but I would imagine that from a legislative point of view, from a regulatory point of view, you may need to construct such things, just to be very clear as to the participation and the KYC AML ideas around it. But just off the cuff, no idea. I can only imagine that might be the case.
From my point of view, I would expect lots of walled gardens where each one is specific to a certain asset type.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
all right. And then my follow-up question for that is the vector for recourse on those markets will be like significantly less liquid, right? Like, would that be like a reasonable expectation?
So repeat that last sentence. Is that the reason for?
For like is that a reasonable expectation? That
Yes.
there would be
Yes. I mean, understand that we've created something, and a gentleman by the name of Greg DePrisco that works for Maker. He just wrote this really nice document, and in there he talks about this effect, this sort of red queen effect that I haven't heard for a long time, where if you build the rails, the rails, the network effect will basically allow everyone to come and actually participate. And what we're talking about now in terms of walled gardens and looking at security tokens, et cetera, is actually due to the fact that Maker exists. And I know everyone would say, yeah, but security tokens would come out anyway, but they would come out, but represented in the form everyone is really used to. So how far they would extend, I have no idea. But with Maker in place, we get these rails that allow us to actually take the full advantage of everything, from the type of securities that can be created all the way through to, how they would look like in a very well-defined regulatory space and in the blockchain, on the blockchain space. Okay, so with 10 minutes left, I don't know if I want to go through, if there's any other questions, please shoot them out. But if the one thing I do want to just quickly touch on is as I mentioned before, the whole thing is about this whole voting process, the governance process is about de-risking contention and also, reducing the chance of having factions. But keep in mind that it's very simple. You start with the dialogue. The dialogue goes into a governance polling, and that governance polling, once it has a natural conclusion, will then become an executive vote. And when I say executive, I don't mean like your level of hierarchy in an organization. I'm talking about it in terms of a vote that gets executed. So that's the intention there. And from start to finish, obviously, what we need to make sure of is that whatever proposal we're talking about can as far as possible, be scientifically vetted and validated. I mean, there are going to be proposals where that's not going to be the case, and we're going to have to figure out a way around it. Like if we want to introduce a new risk team, to a certain extent, that's possible because the models have to be clear, usable, and you need to have a good sense of it. But ultimately, it also boils down to the people. Do you know who they are? What are their background? What do you think about them? There's always going to be some sense of subjectivity, but to the extent possible, we need to try and mitigate that by using models and vetting procedures that have rigor associated with them. So I don't really have, I'm not going to go into any further details, especially when it comes to my favorite topic of where you should stick your MKR tokens. But I will open in the last, we've got about 8 minutes left. Any questions, thoughts?
Well, Gareth has an interesting question. Gareth, do you have access to a mic? If you do, feel free to jump in. Otherwise, I will start reading your question. He wonders, from the MakerDAO side, do we have a legal team working on questions around enforcement? Have we engaged an external counsel, or how do we manage these questions around securities in the future?
Oh, well, at present, we're not obviously directly focusing on that yet, but it is something that we have started not only considering structuring, but talking to the right participants in the market. And this is not necessarily just lawyers, but you can actually, there are entities out there that are that operate in the, how can I call it, the maintenance administrative space, where they actually create the product and they look after it for you, and they make sure that if there are any issues, it does have the necessary recourse into either arbitration or actual, some sort of formulated resolution. So the short answer, I suppose, is yes, but it's not necessarily a legal firm or an entity. It could be just an entity that has its own legal structure around it that it uses.
Did that answer your question, Gareth?
Yeah, so you're looking at more third-party service providers who would be packaging up the collateral and then providing it to you guys as a prepackaged legal instrument, right?
Correct. That would be ideal. In certain circumstances, they wouldn't, and we would need to attach the necessary augmented legal construct onto the collateral type before it is included.
Okay. Okay.
And that's where we would need like our own external legal counsel to help us, do it. Or rather, a risk team would say, let's call it risk team ABC, would look at this collateral type and go, okay, so what's the recourse to it? How enforceable is this? You don't know? Okay, let's go and talk to the legal risk team over there that is a part of the MakerDAO system and see what they say about this and what needs to be put in place. The one thing that I'm sure has become evident through our discussions is that all the service provision around risk management from start to finish is going to be required. And the depth of it is such that you will be able to have literally this specialization of, division of labor and specialization that will see folks make this process become more and more granular until you've actually got an intensely robust ecosystem just around risk management. And then you'll find that ecosystem will start overlapping with keepers, and then it will overlap with DAI users, and then might overlap with CDP users as well. It basically starts gravitating to encompass the whole system and not just be seen isolated from the whole. Anything else? Any other questions?
Yeah, I have
Go ahead.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if the approval of new collateral types is part of the stability mechanism for DAI. So like if DAI is trading below $1, we might not approve new collateral types because we don't want new people to take out CDPs. But if DAI is trading above $1, we may want to approve more collateral types, so that way people can open more CDPs and push DAI back down.
That is part of the calculus that you need to consider when you do vote a new collateral type in. I agree, but it's not a mechanism to control for the peg, if you understand what I'm getting at. It's not a direct controlling mechanism.
It's a consideration.
That implies a certain amount of flexibility that I'm not sure that we have in this system, though. So we're anticipating that we're going to be doing these votes for new collateral types quarterly. Is that true, Steven?
Yes, it could actually be monthly at first. It really just, it's more about how quickly we bootstrap the system and how many collateral types are trying to get on board. So initially it might be monthly, and then eventually the cadence might move to quarterly. But in terms of using the votes on collateral types to manage the peg, that's something, as I said, you can encompass in your decision making, but ultimately it's not a direct lever in the system. It's not intended to be that way.
Adding a collateral type is not exclusively a one-way operation, but it's the expectation is we're going to be adding more than we're going to be removing, right? So creating additional liquidity would be great, but it can't be used to remove liquidity, I think, right? Or dampen liquidity.
Yeah, no, it wouldn't be able to. I mean, it's got a supply side function.
Okay.
But I remember, so Ashley spoke on the community call that you're bringing on all sorts of commodity companies who want to borrow against their inventory for a lower rate. So I'm wondering, like, if David said that we want to start off with a higher stability fee, then what would be the value add for those companies that she's working with if we want to start off with such a high stability fee? Well,
Akiva, that's a lot of information into one thing. So I'm going to let David and Ashley talk on that notion. But I'm very much open to allowing commodity houses to do so. Obviously, the financing aspect of it needs to be competitive, or else we don't have room to move.
Yeah. Also, I just want to point out that I said that you could start off with a higher stability fee in the landscape where the DAI is trading at below $1, and you fear that DAI supply is sort of outpacing DAI demand. Then when you add a new collateral in that context, you might want to start with a higher stability fee to kind of counteract that. But that's not necessarily like the long-term commitment that you're making. That could be adjusted on the fly. But yeah, that's just a point for that. I mean, and I'm sure that if you have like commodity companies leveraging their inventory for how you explained it, I think that if it doesn't make sense, then they're not going to do it. And that also might impact the decision on the stability. But I'm not sure. I could let Ashley speak more to that.
Just on that note, we are at the top of the hour. So if you guys wish to continue, that's great by me. But unfortunately, I need to jump, if you don't mind.
All right, Steven. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, thanks for coming. Take care.
Thanks, Steven.
Have a good one. Ciao.
All right. I wonder if anybody's going to hang out. Does anybody have any other random questions they wanted to ask?
Not me. Maybe not random questions, but we talk a lot about when we're talking about risk parameters as collateral types, because that does seem to be usually the most interesting. But there are other risk parameters worth discussing too, right? Such as, I think the target price is something interesting. Now that DAI has been out for a year and has held its quote peg, does that mean DAI is worth less than it was a year ago, given the inflation rate of the US dollar? I mean, how do people think about setting, or what would people want to talk about in terms of other risk parameters that might be interesting?
Yeah, that's
discussion.
a good point. We generally break things down to 3 primary risk parameters in these calls, and it's good. It's a good reminder that there's actually, I think the last time I counted, there was like 15 of these things. I'm not sure how many of them would be exposed through the proposal process. Presumably all of them, I guess. But
yeah,
that's the plan right now, I think. So.
Yeah. Kenny, maybe for the benefit of people that are new to the system, can you recap what the target price parameter does and how it can be manipulated?
Yeah. So, I mean, for those that, I think probably the audience here is pretty, they probably understand that the point of DAI is not to be worth $1. It's to minimize volatility as much as possible over some period of time. So it's a stable coin in the sense of volatility, not necessarily in the sense of price. So over time, the price of DAI in reference to some external reference point can change. Originally, when we set out to sort of create this stable coin, it was going to reference something completely different than the US dollar. It was going to reference a basket of international currencies. So it doesn't really necessarily matter where you peg it to, or what you reference it to, but there's always a multiple of that thing that you're referencing. So if that thing that you're referencing is doing something like inflating, like the US dollar does, but the market wants the DAI to, let's say, hold its purchasing power, well, then it should appreciate against that, or change against relative to that reference point over time, over some given time, but not necessarily so. Or that can, but it's also part of the feedback mechanisms that are used to control volatility as well.
If I had to guess, I think that we have a few different mechanisms working here.
Yeah.
That maybe we haven't spoken about specifically, but one of those is the fact that there's a certain lifetime associated with this concern about the depreciating value of the dollar, or the inflationary loss, or purchasing power loss of the DAI, right? We've been running for a year, and I think that that's not something that's in the back of people's minds, really, about how much the diminished purchasing power of a DAI against the US dollar over a year doesn't really matter. Over 10 years, it does matter, right? And I think that the main plan right now to compensate for that is probably the DAI savings rate, I think. That's right.
That's very true. And then that, adding that, but that also comes in from, it's funded from the stability fee, and the stability fee is going to have other things demanding against it. So it's always going to be a interesting balance. But I do think, it's very straightforward for somebody to think about, oh, if I put my DAI into this thing, I can earn interest on it, or some return on it. That makes a lot of sense. It's very traditional, but seeing the price slowly deviate from the reference point over time might be a little weird for people. But in the same sense too, it's absolutely not like catastrophic when DAI does do that. And I think we should be careful about messaging that as often as possible.
Well, that's a good conversation to have, because I think that we need to get some alignment on what the severity of a deviation is, because there's been some interesting behavior in the last couple of weeks on the value of DAI. We're creeping up above $1 fairly consistently, if I believe I'm accurate.
Yeah, I think CoinMarketCap is a little because the pairs are other cryptos, and then they're using their own price references to recreate the
Yeah, it's always dangerous to use them, because they're potentially comparing against Tether, or they're against wash traded exchanges. But over a certain time period, I think is generally, you can get a sense of that something has been happening. And I think that the question is, in my mind, is trading at $1.02 for 7 days or a week. Is this an issue? Is this something serious that we need to deal with, or is this just a natural facet of the way that the market has been behaving the last couple of weeks, and that it would eventually recover itself? It's a tough question to answer.
I think it's important to note that the volume weighted number isn't 1.2, or it isn't 1.02. It's like much closer to $1. Like the last trade is most often at whatever that price premium is, but all the volume is happening like right down near $1. And all of the liquidity in the order books are at and below $1. Like, it's not like people are advertising buying DAI for $1.02. Like, that's not happening anywhere. It's just kind of an artifact of how like they're displayed, like the historical data is displayed by like frequency of last trade, and then they just put the volume at the bottom.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think it ties to a conversation that we had at the very top of the hour with you, Nicholas, where I'm extremely interested. I'm becoming even more interested in getting this information that you're talking about acquiring. And so I definitely want to see if there's something we can do to help you out. But figuring out what people are doing with their DAI is a big question mark. And understanding their motivations, I think, might help us to figure out things like this question I'm about to ask, which has been the back of my mind for a while, is that we have these competing incentives. So if DAI is trading high, these groups of actors do these certain things. They either draw more CDP or they pay down their debt. We have all these expectations of what happens when we deviate from the peg. And one of the questions in my mind is what is the threshold that actually gets people interested in doing something? Like what is the price that the DAI needs to be for the average CDP owner to go, oh my God, I can actually get some DAI on the open market and pay down my debt cheaper than when I took it out. And I'm not sure that we've seen, or I don't have a clear sense of what that threshold is. Is it like 2 cents over the peg? Is it 4 cents when people start to wake up to this opportunity, or below it? There are a lot of things I don't quite understand about the system. I
guess that would depend how big their CDP is as well, right?
Well, presumably, yeah. I guess it's still a return. I think it comes back to this thing where most of the models that people come up with, they assume some kind of rationality in the market. And I think that the last year has kind of taught us that there is very little rationality in the market. And so understanding how people do behave as opposed to the ways that they should behave is a big question in my mind, I guess. It could be because I'm naive when it comes to how money actually works. So I'm constantly surprised when it's not the most logical progression of events.
No, I think it's a really good point. Yeah.
Gareth, you had a question. Did you want to jump in and ask that?
Yeah, just when you're talking about liquidating other types of, and maybe Akiva's just answered it actually, but maybe you can give some more detail on that. If you're liquidating other types of collateral that are in the CDP, so for instance, you've got some real estate wrapped up in there from Harbor, and then you're trying to liquidate that. Is it MakerDAO that's always managing that, or somebody else? How do you avoid the centralization risk where all of a sudden you've got one entity holding X $1 million worth of real estate that they're trying to sell over a period of time to stabilize DAI?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think that's a primary consideration when we're talking about real world assets, and Steven touched on that, is with the recourse and liquidity. So it's these things obviously represent real value in the world, more so than crypto does traditionally. But how do those seized assets get returned to the market is the most important part of the process. And when it comes to approving these additional collateral types, my expectation is that there needs to be an extremely robust market for them before we can consider adding them. So there needs to be significant liquidity before we consider adding a REIT or adding a tokenized condo, right?
And to add to that, I think that if you were to do something with like Harbor real estate, then you will probably get, like, I don't know, I envision sort of like a walled garden type of thing where you'd have the auction mechanism, but it would basically just be pointing to a whole different set of market participants, ones that are KYC, AML compliant, and that are basically getting recourse through Harbor, through that basic, I don't know. Yeah, that's what I envision. Obviously, this is all kind of like up in the air, and definitely I was awaiting clarification in the future. But yeah.
So actually, you're probably trying to liquidate the tokens that represent the real world asset and sell those into the market, than actually ever have recourse to the real world asset and try and sell that outside the token structure. Okay.
It's way beyond our remit to actually have to take care or take possession or custody of any of these assets. It's the contracts release things for sale, and there has to be an aftermarket of people incentivized to pick up those tokens and do whatever it is they do with them. But
and I think Harbor is, and the way Harbor does it is they have the infrastructure basically for that, where they do end up eventually facilitating like the real world transfer of the actual asset if necessary. But they provide like a liquid market for the like wrapped up real estate or REIT or whatever it might be.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks, guys.
it's one of the major hurdles to the addition of collaterals, or real world collaterals, because we need the tokenization of the world to start, accelerating a bit and have these robust solutions where, sure, if we want to use tokenized invoices, that's great. That's a huge addressable market, but we cannot be involved at all with the creation or the maintenance of that market. There needs to be sort of a robust ecosystem in place, and those collateral types can be added to CDPs.
Yeah,
So-
Akiva had another question.
So yeah, what I'm just wondering is if, let's say, there's an entity which is both an institutional keeper for buying assets that can only be sold to accredited investors, and they're also a risk team. Can they say as part of the risk team that we have all this capital and we're willing to buy this collateral to bring it onto our own balance sheet, and therefore there should be a higher debt ceiling because we're not even going to liquidate it right away. We're just going to bring it onto our own balance sheet at a discount.
I think that involves a lot of trust, and I think that probably should be something separate from the risk model, because that's not really reproducible in all the other risk teams models. Like, you can't really just add, hey, here's like my promise, I'm not going to sell it for 2 years.
Yeah, I agree. I think there would be some significant contracts in place before that would happen. And I'm not sure that that's the vision that we have for CDPs. It needs to be.
And I don't think it'll be that flexible. I mean, they might be able to do something like OTC with some other keeper participant, and like, I don't know, maybe do like a swap for like different types of CDP debt, and like, I don't know. I think the aftermarket, like the over-the-counter market and the aftermarket, like third-party market, will handle cases like that. But I don't know if it would make a good argument for a higher debt intrinsically. I think the parameters should always kind of link back to the very, very core assessment of the collateral type itself.
All right, I have a hard stop at 15 minutes after the hour, so I think I'm going to stick a fork in this one. Thanks, everybody, for the great call. A lot of amazing questions. So I'll be...
this was good. Thank you.
Yeah, it was a really good one. I'll be uploading this to YouTube presently, and it's also going to go to SoundCloud, and hopefully posted to Reddit soon after. So thanks, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
One day I go to the kitchen.